Hello fellow egoists! Welcome to today's episode of Understanding Ego, the series where we analyze deeper into the themes of Blue Lock. Today we'll be looking at Barou, his ego, life, and the paradox that lives inside of him. But before starting the video, huge thanks to Paidyrbi and Hesha on Twitter for respectively letting me use their artwork and helping me in the process of making this video. Go check them out if you want to see some quality Blue Lock stuff. With that said, let's head straight into it. To start everything, what exactly is Barou's ego? Why does he play football and where does his enjoyment of it come from? Does it come from being a king and the spotlight of the match? Well, absolutely not, and the manga even outright tells it to us in his backstory. In chapter 64 of the manga, we're introduced to Barou's childhood and how he grew into what he currently is. We first see Barou saying to others that they should just support his goals, with the story telling us that Barou had the talent to actually think this way. But oddly enough, even while being treated like a king by the other kids, Barou doesn't seem to be fulfilled in a way. If anything, he looks bored and doesn't understand why others would be ready to become mere supporting actors, asking himself where is the fun in that for them, instead of thinking only about himself and taking pleasure in being treated like a king the way that, for example, Isagi or Kaiser would be. After seeing this, Barou gave up on understanding others, deciding to delve into his own training regimen and way of life, which is where Barou seems to finally be taking pleasure as we see his eyes shining brightly compared to the almost empty look he had while being treated like a king. And finally, after digging deeper into his own self and way of life, Barou realized the most important part of why he continued to play football. To quote him directly, "The reason I like football so much isn't because I get to feel like a king, and of course it's not that I liked to kick a ball around. I merely enjoy the feeling of taking players who just like me, put everything into the sport and using my goals to drag them off the stage. I play football only for this pleasure." And this is exactly Barou's ego. He aims to take the spotlight away from others and enjoys the pleasure from seeing them ruined and destroyed after stealing their passion. To say it in Blue Lock terms, Barou is a villain who takes pleasure only in devouring the light of others. And when we look at Barou this way, as a villain who takes pleasure in taking a spotlight away from others rather than being directly in the spotlight, we see that Barou's highlights are always in this way. From his goal in the U20 match being about devouring the light of Isagi and calling it his favorite meal after being forgotten by the defense, scoring in the Ubers match after seeing that Isagi had become the king of the match and swallowing the whole match with his goal, and finally his awakening in the 3v3 of the second selection, where the entire thing about it was that he was ready to become the villain if it meant it was his way of escaping being a simple sidekick, the one thing he couldn't understand back in his childhood. His awakening in the 3v3 is actually one of the best scenes to see that Barou's ego is this villain persona rather than the king one, as this awakening came from Barou being at the bottom of despair, meaning that this was Barou's true depths and ego, as during an awakening the only thing that comes out is one's true nature. And we'll also know that at no moment during all of the play in Barou's awakening does the theme of the king come into play. It's only after he scores that the term of king comes back, even though in the play itself there was no king's-like mannerism at all. And Sendo's goal in the men's shine match is also a showing of that. We see that Sendo's goal is actually really similar to the way Barou's goal in the U20 match was drawn, and generally the play itself was close to a one-to-one recreation of it. And what did Barou himself call that goal? One that he had already done in his past and considered himself a king for? A hyena goal. There are other subtle details that show this, such as Barou's aura being blue during the Team X match, where he was arguably at the peak of his king's-like persona, and the red color of his aura only awakening during the 3v3, where, as we said, only the villain persona came into play. As Rio says, "You're no king, you're a goddamn joker." But one of the biggest showing of Barou's ego being about devouring the light of others and taking pleasure in it comes in the form of the spiral eyes. For those who watch the channel regularly, you must know by now that this eye design is actually a showing of someone following their original ego, which I thoroughly explained back in my video about Rin's eyes in the U20 match. And so for Barou, do we ever see the spiral eyes? Well, we see them only once, but not when he's acting like a king, but rather when he trash talks Isagi in the Team X match and tells him that he's absolutely talentless and isn't fit to be a striker, following again the villainous ego we highlighted earlier. So with all this, we see that Barou's ego is one of a villain taking pleasure in the act of stealing the spotlight from others rather than purely being in the spotlight like a king would. Two concepts which are at odds with each other and that Barou keeps trying to force to coexist even if they can't. Even downright to the essence of the ego types, we see that those two ideas cannot coexist and that one must triumph against the other. As Barou's villainous ego is undeniably a self-type ego, where Barou's pleasure and value comes before the world's compared to the king persona, which is much more akin to that of a world type who absolutely wants to be seen by the eyes of others and the world. So really what Barou is trying to do throughout the manga is that of keeping a facade, one of a king which is personified via his lion aura. But what if I tell you that Barou's true aura isn't a king, a lion? When looking back at Barou's flashbacks and awakening in the 3v3, what do we see? We actually see a demon-like aura looking like the one of a Noni, a beast-like ghost from Japanese folklore which tends to be associated with the color red and destruction. It's only after Barou's awakening that the lion appears as Barou tries to keep the facade of a king. A facade which, when we look into it, tends to be the Barou's downfall actually. As we see throughout the story, whenever Barou goes too deep into his king persona, he ends up failing one way or another. With Team X, we see in the episode Nagi rendition that Team X ended up being a failure of a team where only Barou was able to do anything. In the 3v3, we also saw how it's only after Barou let the king persona go and embraced the villain that he was able to swim out of despair. And finally, in the nail, while Barou's king act managed to get him to score the first goal for Ubers, he then needed to throw away Ubers' crown and quote-unquote usurp the team following his ego of wanting to devour Isagi, that he was finally able to score, only to then fail at his responsibilities by losing with the team, and the final nail in the coffin being Sendo scoring a hyena goal, ensuring that Barou's kingship over Ubers has shown enough cracks in it that even Sendo of all people is able to get a goal in over Barou. Through all of those examples, we see that Barou's passion and drive for football only appears when following his ego of being a villain, compared to that of being a king. But if Barou's true form is that of a villain, we can ask ourselves, why does he keep trying to be a king, and how can he get rid of this paradox in his identity? For Barou's obsession with being a king, we have to look at Barou's ego and its consequences. Because Barou steals the spotlight from others and gets pleasure from that, he will naturally become the lead actor of the field, aka what he calls the king. But we know that being the lead actor isn't necessarily about being the king. For example, in Rin's performance in the U20 match while awakened, we couldn't call Rin a king because of the way he went alone and single-handedly destroyed the team by himself. We would even call this disgusting. So really Barou's obsession with the king theme comes from a place of misunderstanding what exactly is a king. What does he desire and not feeling the nuance in said desire. Though the fact that Barou doesn't seem to realize this nuance in his desire is a showing of something else. The fact that Barou hates to internalize things when he isn't forced to. We see it with how he gets constantly called out on his personality, or how he would rather die than not being able to get past with his dribbling in episode Nagi. While he was eventually able to overcome this hurdle, it came from a place of necessity and it was a hard thing for Barou to do. In this sense, we see how Barou tends to be a sort of blockhead, who keeps fighting with purely his ego and can't see things outside of it, which is exactly what Snuffy called out in his talk with Barou and generally his philosophy. In general, Snuffy's philosophy and advices for Barou are perfect lenses to see through Barou's character, and more specifically his future, which was the entire theme of the Ubers match. Snuffy's philosophy, when stripped down to its core and the way it's actualized, is all about knowing how to handle yourself with things outside of purely passion. To be able to live with yourself even if your passion starts to fade away or is put in a harsh situation. Living purely off of passion leads to a non-stable path that will usually lead to the archetype of the artist who burns away everything in the pursuit of greatness and dies depressed while overdosing on drugs, which is akin to what happened to Mick. So while we know that Snuffy's philosophy helps avoid this case, we can ponder on something. What did Barou do with this philosophy? Well, for this we just have to look at Barou's highlight of the Ubers match. If the day comes where I can't become the #1 king of football, then I'd rather go out in the blaze of glory. Showing that Barou actually went against Snuffy's philosophy and fully dived into the archetype of the person burning away with raw passion and only that. So Barou not only showed that he was indeed similar to Mick in nature in how they live only through their ego, but also how they reject Snuffy's philosophy to continue living the way they want. Though, does that mean that Barou will necessarily end up just like Mick? Well, for this we first have to look at the fact that Barou and Mick, while they are similar in their essence of brute forcing life through their passion and ego, are also different in their way of acting upon that ego. Where Mick had no discipline in training, Barou has it and generally won't end up a total drunkard similarly to Mick, but we do see in the 3v3 of the second selection that the moment Barou imagined himself outside of purely his passion, he seemed like a person who totally void, that just drank while looking at his regrets. So even if Barou won't end up literally like Mick, there is indeed a precedent that if Barou ever ends up in a situation where he can brute force through sheer ego and willpower like he did in the 3v3 or the Ubers match, then a true challenge that will shake him to his core will appear. So what form exactly would this challenge take? Well, while we don't necessarily have a good grasp of what it could be yet, we already have two important hints to what it might entail. In chapter 19 of episode Nagi, we have Nagi, Chigiri and Barou talking in their room after losing to Rin's team. In this talk, we actually see a lot of the things that we highlighted earlier in the video, such as Barou lacking something decisive to be able to beat Isagi, which we know is a true self-awareness of his ego, or how he can only see himself evolving on the battlefield compared to also thinking outside of it, which is what Nagi calls out directly. But what's really important for us comes after this when Hiragi comes to the trio's room to give them a tarot card reading. In this card reading, Barou gets a truly interesting card, the Hanged Man, holding in its meaning training, endurance and growth through trials, anticipating a problem that will come from the outside and that can only be overcome through sheer endurance. To say it more clearly, curbing his ego in the midst of restriction will be the key for Barou to awaken. And if you pay close attention to everything that this card entails, you'll see that it's actually a perfect fit for Snuffy's philosophy and how it helps to deal with setbacks, as to be able to still live outside of them. So with all this, we could theorize that Barou's future trial will be coming in the form of something like an injury that Barou won't be able to just go through with purely ego. The same way that Mick and Snuffy overworked themselves after being too lax as to compensate their lack of effort beforehand, and so got into a downward spiral, we could see Barou getting an injury of some kind from overworking himself and going into the same spiral as Mick. Except that Barou would also go further than Mick, and instead of dying alone in his home, Barou would force himself on the field as to go out in a blaze of glory, just like he prophesied for himself. Though, if Barou indeed gets an injury and goes out in a blaze of glory, is it the end of his story? Well, we don't actually know yet, and while I doubt that Barou's story would end up simply at that, and I could see him actually bounce back from it after help with Snuffy, the possibility of him just going out in the blaze of glory is just as important. In general, I'm pretty sure that Barou will get an injury of some kind from the way his tarot card reading was being written, and that it will be a setback that Barou won't be able to control, and that only endurance will help him overcome. But it could honestly be something different, and only time will tell what awaits our villainous Oni, Barou. So in this part we'll be talking about more subtle things that I couldn't fit to the other two parts but I still find are really important to highlight. The first one is about Barou's rivalry with Isagi and why does it have such a strong chemistry. For this we need to look at my video about Isagi's ego and highlight that Isagi's ego is all about being the protagonist of the field, the one at the center of everyone's eyes and therefore becomes the biggest light on the field, the thing that Barou absolutely wants to devour as to feel pleasure. So really Barou's obsession with Isagi comes from the fact that Isagi's ego and playstyle is the peak of what Barou tries to destroy. A person giving it his all to the sport and that shines ever so brightly because of it. But because Isagi is a character that knows how to rebuild himself even after being destroyed, it creates a sort of constant loop with their characters where Isagi shines as a protagonist by fulfilling his ego, only for Barou to then devour that light created as to fulfill his urges, and after that Isagi is able to recreate the light again, which then recreates one more loop of devouring for both of our characters. So to say it clearly, both characters are two sides of the same coin. Both devour each other But where Isagi takes pleasure in the consequences of devouring, so to say, becoming the lead actor, to be the king, Barou takes pleasure in the act of devouring by itself and dragging people off their stage, where for Isagi it's simply a step in the process. The second thing I wanted to talk about is something more interesting relating to the world of Blue Lock, which I had already talked about in my first video ever on the channel, that being the link between weapons and ego. As we see throughout the story, a character's ego and his weapons are actually deeply linked. Bachira has the ego to be one with the ball, and so his dribbling is his biggest weapon. For Isagi, he wants to be the protagonist at all costs, and so his weapon is his vision to be able to tell which protagonist does he need to devour to then become the lead actor. And of course there are many more examples. And so, for Barou, how does his weapons relate to his ego? Well, for the chop dribble, we have to look at Barou's first awakening and how he develops said chop dribbling. That being the act of faking a pass to someone else and then devouring the light of the other person to go for his own glory. Barou's chop dribbling is all about faking a pass to someone, making them think they'll become the lead actor only to steal that joy away from them. To fake being a supporting actor to then make the other fall off higher than normal. Whereas his right leg middle shot shows Barou's strong set of values that come in the form of his training, which is what birthed this technique of his. And of course his charging power, which comes from his strong will, passion and blockheadedness. And now for the final part of the video we can talk again about Barou's true aura, that being the Red Lightning Oni. Onis are a kind of Japanese demon which appear in various folklore stories and the general aesthetic of traditional Japan. We could call them Japan's equivalent of ogres for a more grounded mental image. And so we get similar themes between the two of them, such as superhuman strength, murder, cannibalism and generally a high level of violence that we can clearly see in Barou's general behavior on the field. And also aura, but they also tend to be associated with the color red and the element of lightning, which is a one-to-one fit for Barou's aura. We could go even further with this parallel and argue that Barou's haircut is akin to the horn of an Oni, which is why he keeps it down when he isn't on the field. But Barou's aura and behavior also goes deeper into another aspect of Japanese culture through the form of Barou's almost quote-unquote old man behavior, in the way that Barou likes to keep things clean and is obsessive about his values. We could say that Barou is a sort of twist and representation of the Japanese kamikaze and Bushido code culture, which were birthed from samurais and soldiers preferring to die on the field with honor than to go and be alive with their set of values being betrayed. A perfect fit for Barou's character and his infamous quote, "If I can't become the king, I'd rather go out in a blaze of glory." So just like how Isagi is supposed to be a twist on the average Japanese person and represent an answer to that path, Barou is instead Kanashiro's twist on people who prefer to die by their passion than to live. So if you've ever found yourself in similar shoes to Barou or generally in a similar mindset, then keep in mind that Barou's current journey and what it's all about is about showing the flaws in his mentality but also how to overcome them, or at least what the author of Blue Lock thinks is a good answer for you. And with all that said, the video is finally over. But before leaving, I just want to thank everyone for the 2000 subscriber count. It's a pleasure to see the channel growing and more people interacting with the content. As to celebrate all this, I'll be hosting soon a live stream where I'll be responding to various questions from personal ones to Blue Lock related ones over any topic you guys might want to talk about. For more details, you can go check out the Discord server of the channel or my personal Twitter, though I'll be honest, I should post more than I post actual analyses there. But with all that said, thanks for watching, have a great one, fellow egoists.